I'm Mark Johnson. I'm Senior Vice President for Tetra Tech's Global Development Services Division. Welcome to this great panel that we have today, and it could not be any more fitting for our conference theme. We're living through a climate crisis and in turn a global food security crisis. Global food systems are under immense threat and pressure from climate extremes, presenting a true challenge to our community to develop smart, innovative, sustainable solutions for agricultural resilience. I want to thank you to our panel today. We're really lucky to have Sue Chodakowicz from the Cadmus Group here with us. I've known Sue for many, many years. I had the pleasure of working with her at Tetra Tech. Prior to her current role as Chief Growth Strategy Officer for Cadmus, Sue led Nathan Associates, which we all know so well, for many, many years. And as I said, she was a colleague of mine at Tetra Tech and led and served as the president of our Tetra Tech aviation and management subsidiary. She has decades of experience and accomplishments. She's a true leader in our industry and a strategic thinker. She's perfectly placed for leading us through this panel today, and we're so grateful to all the panelists today. So Sue, I'm going to turn it over to you and take it away.
Thank you so much for the kind words and the introduction, and welcome to everyone here in the room today and online. As you know, today's panel will focus on the disturbing nexus between food security and climate change, and how these twin and mutually reinforcing challenges, exacerbated by a combination of other factors, including the COVID pandemic, the ongoing increasing conflicts and civil unrest, and deepening inequalities, are intensifying and broadening these problems at alarming rates. In turn, this creates a horrific snowball effect in which resulting livelihood loss, malnutrition, rising costs, and competition over scarce resources make combating the underlying root causes even more difficult. To turn the tide and save millions of lives and achieve global food security and zero hunger, much needs to be done from an integrated, multidisciplinary approach. At the forefront, however, is clearly the agriculture sector, defined in the broadest terms, which must be resilient to the impact of climate change while curbing greenhouse emissions. We must consider moving towards climate resilient food systems and ultimately climate resilient food systems transformation. Given the enormity of the topic and its criticality and the length of this panel, I want to spend as much time as possible hearing from our panelists today, who are exceptionally well positioned to address these issues. Therefore, my very brief introductions will not do their careers justice. Okay, so let me start with introducing Nancy Eslick, who is the Senior Deputy Assistant to the Administrator for USAID's Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security, which supports implementation of the Water for the World and Feed the Future initiatives. Ms. Eslick also serves as the USAID Global Water Coordinator, leading the agency's implementation responsibilities under the U.S. Global Water Strategy. Most recently, she was the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Assistance, Private Sector, and Donor Coordination, focused on developing initiatives for Ukrainian efforts in the Bureau for Europe and Eurasia. Before joining USAID in 2001 as a Presidential Management Fellow, Ms. Eslick began her development career as a Peace Corps volunteer. Welcome. To her left is Dr. Alex Loch. Dr. Loch is a senior climate change specialist at the World Bank and has contributed significantly to various areas of research and development. His work spans climate risk management, natural resource management, and analytical support for spatial analysis and geographic information systems. Excuse me. He holds a PhD in geoinformation science from Boston University, and his undergraduate degrees are in physical geography and agricultural sciences, earned from the Free University and Humboldt University in Berlin, Germany. In addition, Mr. Lodge also serves as adjunct faculty member at George Mason University. Alex, thanks for being here today. And finally, at the end of the table is Ms. Carolyn Gruber. Ms. Gruber is a fellow and deputy director of the Environmental Security Program at the Stimson Center. Most recently, she served as a foreign affairs officer with the Office of Marine Conservation in the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Previously, she was a foreign affairs specialist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA's National Marine Fisheries. She came to Washington in 2015 after graduate school as a John A. Naus Marine Policy Fellow. So, as you can see today, and as reflected by the complete fullness, standing room only of this room, we've got a great combination of people here today. So, let's get started. I'd like to spend, now I'd really like to spend, wow, what a difference. I'd like to ask each of you just to spend a couple of minutes to frame or define how your respective organizations or programs approach this issue, this very tricky, complicated nexus between food security and climate, how you prioritize, how you delineate it, and overall, how you look at it going forward. Will you start, Nancy?
Sure. And thanks so much, Sue. I really appreciate SID inviting USAID to participate in this panel and talk about this incredibly important issue that we're all facing right now. So how I'm looking at it and how USAID looks at it is that we've got two immense challenges: food security on one side, climate change on the other, and they're interwoven and interconnected. And that's how we have to look at it. So globally, agriculture and agri-food systems employ 1 billion people, making these 1 billion people incredibly vulnerable to climate shocks. So, but these same systems actually contribute to 30% of all global greenhouse emissions. So let's go to the global south. And what does it look like there? There's hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers and families that are producing up to 80% of the food for themselves, their communities, and those in the global south. Yet these are the people that are contributing least to the climate problem. But yet they're impacted most by the changes that we're seeing. And the people that are impacted most, a lot of it is women who are taking the brunt and are a victim of climate change. So what this tells me is that there are two things. First, in order to solve the climate crisis, we have to integrate adaptation and mitigation across all of USAID sectors, whether that's water, health, nutrition, agriculture, and look at an integrated approach. And the second is, in order to make progress on global hunger and malnutrition, if we're not focusing on climate, we're not going to reach our goals. If we're not looking at how we're interlinking biodiversity and other issues involving the environment, we're not going to reach these goals. So we're taking a hard look at how we do everything, how we get better information to the people making decisions and to communities that are often left behind. But also we're looking at how we scale and develop technologies and practices to help farmers adapt now and adapt for long-term change. We're looking at how we might crowd in investments for climate resilience. But I think what we all know, what's happening right now is the clock is ticking, time is facing us, and issues are accelerating. So like the economic impacts, if we don't make changes now, climate change could reduce Africa's GDP by 7%, yet they're only contributing 4% of global climate change impacts. In health, we're going to see wetter climates, actually drier and wetter climates. And what's going to happen with this is we're going to see increased malaria. We're going to see increased disease on livestock and other animals, lack of access to fresh water, which then is going to contribute to larger development outcomes in education, women's gains, off-farm employment. And the result of this might be an additional 100 million people in poverty by 2030. So from USAID, it's not just about the crisis that I can sit here and we can sit here and talk about, but it's also about in the over 100 countries that we work in, what we're hearing from our partners. They want solutions to climate, and they're asking us to help them so that they can invest in their own futures.
Thanks so much, Nancy. Lots of key issues teed up for discussion. Alex, over to you.
Sure. Thank you. Both of us work for a development organization. I work for the World Bank Group, obviously a major multilateral development organization. So many of the factoids that I had in my talking points align with yours in terms of framing the problem, the impact of climate change, the food insecurity on poor people. You know all the backdrop. It's the framing for this session. One thing to highlight is, and perhaps also a widely known fact, the targets that we set ourselves as the global community of nations in the Paris Agreement, these climate temperature targets are basically unachievable. All assessments, all research points to the fact that the third of these global greenhouse gas emissions that come from the agri-food system cannot stay. They have to be effectively eliminated to have even a small chance of not flying by these temperature targets by mid-century. So that's important backdrop to a lot of what we do at the World Bank, including in the agriculture and food global practice, which is my current affiliation within the institution. From that point, and I'll shamelessly use this opportunity to make a plug for a forthcoming report of ours, Recipe for a Livable Planet, to be launched next month. So stay tuned for that. There we're focusing or shifting the focus much more squarely on the mitigation part of the problem. From our organization, food insecurity, resilience of food systems, resilience in general has been the thrust of what we've been investing in and focusing on in general, but also in the food system. What has been somewhat the neglected child of climate action has been food system mitigation action. And so our report is really squarely trying to focus on that, given the circumstance that a third of these global emissions come from the agri-food system, and they need to be effectively eliminated, taken out of the global economy over the next couple of decades. Now, how do we get there? Let me just outline the five solutions areas that we see as we see them, and they will drive much of what we and many others will engage in the years going forward. So first of all, and it came out in Nancy's comments as well, we're not focusing on agriculture alone. That's, of course, part of the food system. It's an integral part of the food system, how we produce food on farm, but it's the food system overall, including all the inputs, the land, the energy, the fertilizers that you need to enter the farm to produce food, but also, and very importantly, the post-production sources of emissions. And in many of the middle-income countries, and I'll get back to that, some of these sources are humongous and growing rapidly. Emissions associated or embedded with food loss and waste, with increasing energy used in cold chains, and further upstream, of course, the production of fertilizer, much of which is produced and consumed and used in middle-income countries. So we're looking at the totality of the agri-food system, and the conclusion that we come to, you have to be very comprehensive, really tackle the entire value chain, all the parts of the food system to make a measurable and meaningful dent into this global emissions profile that we heard about. So sustainable land use is one of the most important ingredients of this recipe, to use land much more efficiently and effectively. As a ballpark number that we have in some of our reports is that 85 gigatons, that's 85 billion tons, if you can picture that, that's about 1.5 times the global emissions from the entire global economy. That amount of emissions could be reduced simply by allocating land much more efficiently. And you can do that while not compromising economic growth and development, and while achieving and pursuing biodiversity conservation. So there's this co-benefit, the synergy to be had by using land much more efficiently, bringing down emissions by doing so, and maintaining economic growth, especially in our client countries, which need that growth, and boosting resilience and protecting nature. So that's one important area of the equation. The other one is, of course, clean, low emissions inputs to food production, as I just mentioned. Fertilizer production being an important source of emissions in the agri-food system. Just one number to throw out there, 75% of the emissions associated with fertilizer production, a very energy intensive industrial process, could be avoided if you switch to renewables. So that's a big slice of that emissions pie if you want. Then moving on farms, of course, there's many opportunities how you can produce livestock, rice, and other activities more efficiently. As an example, we engage very ambitiously on methane emissions associated with rice production. One of our clients, Vietnam, the Vietnam government has a very ambitious target to implement, for instance, 1 million hectares of low emission rice based on piloting and investments that we made earlier that showed that you can bring down emissions, drive up revenue for farmers, and boost resilience of the production system, rice production system in the lower Mekong Delta, for instance. Similarly, Morocco, another client of ours, has also a 1 million hectare target to turn traditional industrial agriculture into carbon sequestering, regenerative agriculture. Again, large numbers, 1 million hectares. So those are actions on farm that we can take in addition to powering machinery with renewable energy sources and so on and so forth. And then in post-production, I mentioned many opportunities in making cold chains more sustainable, low emissions, working with consumers, and that's the fifth and other key component, engaging consumers that drive much of that demand for food. Of course, all of us need to eat. And there's also very innovative solutions that I can perhaps talk about in a moment, how we can help consumers change their behavior, therefore having a very measurable impact on the food system and the emissions profile overall. Overall, one of the things we find is you can do all of this. There's, of course, potential trade-offs, but if you implement these actions carefully, if you design policies carefully, if you bring stakeholders along, be inclusive in this process, there is no inherent trade-off in achieving these emission reduction targets, boosting resilience, and really creating also opportunities for farmers in that process. One last point, and again, I will come back to that perhaps as our further discussion. Every country, and that's really the perspective that we take in our report, the Recipe for a Livable Planet, every country needs to take part in this transformation. High-income countries, middle-income countries, low-income countries. It's not a high-income country agenda only. It's not a low-income country agenda only. In fact, much of the potential opportunity that we have sits in middle-income countries. Again, many of our clients are emerging economies, fall in that category of middle-income countries. And again, another number, 75 of the cost-effective or affordable opportunity to reduce emissions in the agri-food system globally sits in middle-income countries. So that really focuses our action to that group of countries, and just stressing that high-income countries and low-income countries have other parts to play in this solution space. Let me stop here. I have more points on many of these points, but we can maybe get to those later. So in the interest of time, back to you, Sue.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And what a great holistic playbook, really helpful to set the stage. And Carolyn, let me go over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. I think what I'll do is touch a little bit on one of the things that Nancy said and a little bit on one of the things that Alex mentioned. In terms of scale, the Stimson Center offers an analysis, the Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Initiative. We call this CORVI. I'll throw a lot of acronyms at you, so please just stop me if you need something. The Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Initiative is at a slightly different scale than the one that Nancy was kind of describing. We are zooming down into the very local level. So we're taking an analysis of climate and ocean risk at a city level. So for example, we just kicked off a program in Belize City, and we're thinking about the climate risks and ocean risks and coastal risks at a very fine scale. So we're looking at a city level. So in terms of flood risk, informal housing, making sure that the solutions that we create are super tailored to the city is really essential. For example, in one of the, in Madagascar, in the northern part of the country, there was an incredible drought. At the same time, there were incredible floods in the southern part of the country. So it really shows that there's a need for this sort of local analysis of what climate risks look like for you in your city. And then in terms of working with stakeholders, as Alex mentioned, that is the essential component of our work. We usually have what we call a Corvi champion. So someone who is in with the city government, national government, who can help us get to the right people to understand and fill data gaps. So a lot of the data on climate risk and climate vulnerabilities all occurs either at the national level or at a regional level. And what Corvi does is creates a data set at the city or local level. And that requires a lot of talking to people, a lot of different experts, a lot of different analysis together, and bringing stakeholders along with us. I think one of the most important things to think about is that the climate finance that we are seeking, first of all, we're about $366 billion short over the next few years. And of that gap, only about 10% of climate finance actually reaches a local level. It usually gets to the national level and then is kind of dispersed. So I think one of the gaps that Corvi can fill is this city need, this local need to be more specific and more realistic about what climate risks look like for those places. This is especially the case in terms of food security for fisheries. So a lot of the places where we work have a very high reliance on fisheries, whether it's for subsistence, whether it's in support of larger like aquaculture or larger commercial fisheries industries. And just being able to think through that and kind of walk through some of the things that Alex described about how we consider the inputs for these things, how we consider the needs of local stakeholders. I think it provides a really interesting way to look at this problem. And I appreciate the chance to talk more.
Great. So each of you have touched upon really interesting, unique perspectives of the problem, but also highlighted how interconnected everything is, right? And in some ways, it's that holistic, interconnected challenge that has made this such a sticking point in the past, right? I think we all recognize that the adoption of climate resilience and mitigation measures have been slower than we wanted. So I'd like to ask, before we look forward, just to share quickly what you think some of those stumbling blocks have been in the past, how you're integrating them into your solutions going forward, and how do you manage that given all the top priorities that you're all dealing with. So Nancy, if you want to kick that off.
Sure, thanks. So kind of bulking all three of these questions together. Okay. I think first of all, I really appreciated SID's title this year, Sparks of Hope. And guys, I'm just gonna say there's some chairs up here. Yes. If you guys all wanna come in, like we're a friendly, just chatty group today. Yes. There's a bunch of seats up here. And first of all, so building on that Sparks of Hope, I actually want to answer this from a point of optimism, and that's talking about clean energy and the transformation in clean energy that we've seen. You know, in 2010, since 2010, the cost of solar power has dropped 85%, and the cost of wind power has dropped 55%. So in almost every place that USAID works, new renewable energy is available and it's cheaper than fossil fuels. So what we're seeing in these countries is that for every $1 invested in fossil fuels, there's $1.70 invested in a renewable. And just 5 years ago, that was actually a 1-to-1 ratio. So now it's a 1 to 1.7 ratio. So what we're seeing is an acceleration of adaptation and mitigation. And we all work in some of the hardest places that people say it's not possible. Why are you going to invest there? And quite frankly, I think it's worth investing. And I think this is why sometimes things have been slow, because it's about getting the right technology and getting the information to people about what might work. And so whether that's investing in a solar powered refrigerator, a new seed, or a better way to get to market, when there is the right technology, people are willing to invest for a long-term yield. And it's all about really connecting markets and innovation and demand together so that we're bringing together climate resilient food security, and that drives improved diets, and we can have a better return. And so I know that we need to significantly ramp up all of our climate programs. I just also want to acknowledge the hard work that's happened over the last couple of decades, which I'll really say is providing the foundation of what's happening now and needed to be done. Like, you guys, that we're in the development business. Behavior change is hard. So I'll say that's what we've done the last couple of decades. We've put the right policies, we've created the right educational changes that people understand. Private sector is now ready to go. But with all of these in place, I think that we're ready to really zoom ahead. You want me to stop there? You want me to go on?
Why don't you stop
Okay,
there?
we'll stop there.
Oh, sorry. Why don't you stop there, and we'll turn to Alex and then come back to the forward-looking piece.
I guess this panel would be even more chatty if we sat in armchairs and had a warm beverage. We'll have to work around the logistics here. Does this work?
Try again.
Where's the magic button here? Okay, building out what we just heard from Nancy and earlier from you, Carolyn, as well. Finance is, of course, an integral part of the solution. More money, to put it in a nutshell. And I'm speaking here, of course, from the perspective of a development institution that provides financial instruments to solve problems. But just stepping back and responding to your question, Sue, earlier, what has caused this sluggishness of the response? And I would, in addition to finance, I would maybe first mention a few other points. Inertia, broadly speaking, you could summarize them. And first of all, consumers drive a lot of what happens in the food system. I mentioned earlier, decisions consumers make as a collective has a much higher impact on emissions than tweaking the efficiency of production on the farm. Changing your diet, changing your food choices, what you buy in the store, in accumulation has a much bigger impact if implemented fully than tweaking what we do on farms. So consumers have a big role to play, but we're also a very sluggish species in many ways. So there's a lot of inertia in human behavior, but also, and again, perhaps for another time, there's many innovative solutions how you can nudge our behavior in a more climate positive direction. So that's at the very tail end of the food web of the value chain, the consumer choices, but also further upstream, there's inertia in infrastructure. I mentioned earlier, low emissions rice production. That, of course, requires leveling of terraces. It requires irrigation infrastructure, pipes, etc. Once that stuff is built, it usually sticks around and needs to be paid off over decades. But again, there is innovative solutions, private-public partnership, for instance, to finance infrastructure differently, decommission maybe non-resilient infrastructure, and switching to other production practices. So that's an important area as well, the inertia associated with built infrastructure. Also, what governments do around the world is causing a lot of inertia and wrong incentives, sometimes perverse incentives. Of course, there's a lot of government spending, a lot of it in middle-income countries. As I mentioned earlier, they play a major role in this space. And what we find, simply redirecting, not cutting subsidies in government spending, but redirecting it for more climate positive action could have a major impact. So there's, again, a certain inertia that you need to overcome in terms of how governments behave using their scarce, but oftentimes voluminous resources to bring about transformation. And now coming back to finance, the point that really stimulated this point, you drill down at the local level. If you look at the global level, we have the 1/3 number, a third of global emissions come from the agri-food system. A mere 4.3% are devoted to agri-food system action. A mere 4.3% of climate finance is devoted to agri-food system action. And 2.4% of mitigation finance is going towards the food system. So there is a major reason why we haven't made bigger inroads into transforming the food system. The finance is simply not there yet. And we have a number of ideas how we can change that. But again, just to keep the conversation flowing, I'll maybe just pass on the microphone and come back to some of the financial solutions in a moment.
Great, thanks, Alex. And Carolyn, we'll give you the mic now and then come back to this issue of solutions and priorities going forward.
Certainly. I think one of the things that we can talk a little bit more as we discuss that Alex touched on is access to finance in new and different ways, right? So for example, in Belize, the public debt in 2020 was 103%. So this isn't, while Belize may need additional funding, they simply cannot take on any more debt in the traditional sense. And so having these innovative solutions that Alex briefly touched on, for example, blue and green bonds, other long-term resilient financing options for countries that are interested and ready and able to implement some really interesting and cool, exciting projects, whether it's transforming their infrastructure, addressing internal flooding. There's a lot of sparks of hope, I think. And I'm very lucky to get to see that at the very local level. We work with cities. We work really closely with, for example, city engineers. I was just speaking with a city engineer for Belize City, talking through some of the issues with informal housing, wetland management, mangrove degradation and erosion, and just thinking about the layered nature of those stressors is something that I think we need to do more of and also be able to finance better. So understanding that if you do support mangroves and plant them and address erosion in this way, there will be benefits. Granted, they are long-term benefits. They're not necessarily a quick return on investment. Mangroves grow sometimes a little bit slowly. But I think just recently a paper in Science confirmed that conservation actions do not only halt biodiversity loss, but reverse it. So there are other ways to do these kind of to do these projects and to finance projects that can really truly make a difference on the ground.
Great, thank you. What I'd like to do is ask one more question to the panelists, then open it up for questions quickly, and then come back with one final question before we break. So we talked about sort of at the very high level, some of the key elements of the problem, the reasons for inertia, the reasons for hope. But I'd love to hear from each of you, what are some of the successes? What are some of the lessons learned? What have we seen in terms of sustained change to create the kind of future that we need? And Nancy, I'm going to start with you, and then we can just go down the table.
I'm like, okay, which mic? So thanks for this question on the lessons learned. I think one lesson learned for us and what we're working on right now is connecting all of our strategies together. Making sure not just that we're doing programming, but strategically we're in place. And what was missing was a climate change strategy. So we put that in place. We created some really ambitious targets of meeting 500 million people with climate adaptation solutions. But it's about connecting it, Caroline, to the local level and what that looks like. I've spent a lot of my career overseas. And a little bit over a decade ago, I was in Pakistan. And when I was in Pakistan, the once in 100-year flood hit with a third of the country underwater and 1/4 of its population displaced. So what happened this year? About 12 years later, once in a century flood happened again in Pakistan. So that once in a century flood is now once a decade. And so how are we going to, the solutions, the lessons learned, how are we going to change? How are we as an organization going to adapt? And part of that is really in Pakistan, it's looking outside of ourselves in financing and partnerships. And so I'll often say there's no amount of development money in the world that's going to solve the solutions. And nor the solutions just rest with us. We've got to partner in new ways. And that includes bringing in the private sector. And that's what we did in Pakistan. What we did was we created a public-private partnership under the Green Climate Alliance, with Coca-Cola Foundation, with World Wildlife Fund, and really trying to invest in nature-based solutions, which will have a direct benefit on the 7 million farmers. And the hope is in those nature-based solutions, which is not what we were doing 10 years ago, will protect the farmers from the annual monsoons. I think I agree with you completely on rice and try to look at rice. I think those were a lot of lessons learned in terms of methane production in rice, how we plant new seed varieties. We use those through innovation in what we're doing in research, but it's about bringing it to the local level and that application of what we've learned. I'll leave it there. I've got a few more, but.
I'm technically challenged today. This microphone does not work for me. Shifting to what we've learned, and again, maybe just taking a quick step back before I answer that more directly. As many of you will have heard, that the World Bank has a new president, and he's really ramping up the ambition of what he and the institution wants to deliver with all of its partners. Partnerships are very central to that. As part of that, and you will have heard about that perhaps as well, we have now 6 global challenge programs that focus on these big global challenges, energy, biodiversity, forests, energy transition, etc. And one of them has to do with food and nutrition security. And the idea really behind this program is take on many of the lessons that we've learned, both to respond to short-term crises, acute hunger hotspots, etc., the vulnerability that is exposed in many of the situations that came up in the panel discussion, but also look forward how we really ramp up our tool set to bring more finance towards the solution. So one element of that came up earlier, become innovative using, for instance, impact bonds to bring it private sector investors with a cause to help with our solution. That would be one instrument. Also using various forms of guarantee instruments to bring down the risk in fragile or high risk investment environments or countries to attract the private sector. That's part of the solution. We've learned a great deal about how to do that effectively, and we want to apply that in this new challenge situation much more ambitiously going forward. We've also learned a lot about the last 10 years in terms of results-based climate finance, really turning the financial model around. You don't pay for the inputs for farmers or other producers, but you define an outcome target, reduced emissions while maintaining social co-benefits, for instance, and you pay for that result. The result is often measured in tons of carbon reduced or avoided. And we have major funds and partnerships with civil society organizations, with the private sector, with indigenous peoples representatives. We've sort of figured out how to do this at scale, at the scale of jurisdictions, at the scale of states or provinces and countries, and in some countries for the entire country. Really try to turn around how we use land use, reduce emissions, while maintaining or performing agricultural production much more efficiently and with more social and environmental integrity. So one of the things this is one of the areas where we've learned that, and that's one of the areas that we want to really scale up in this global challenge program context, using these innovative instruments, guarantees, bonds, results-based climate finance, and carbon markets, which also have evolved rapidly and are supported by the World Bank through various initiatives, tapping the capital that is flowing into carbon markets for better environmental outcomes in emissions reductions and boosted resilience in the agri-food system. So the importance of high integrity carbon markets and carbon credits is an important lesson that we have learned. We have now several jurisdictional programs, as I mentioned, across the world, in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America, that really are implementing such programs that maintain land use, maintain carbon-rich ecosystems, transform land use in partnerships with, say, commodity producers, smallholder farmers, local communities, and really keep the carbon in the ground, and therefore become incentivized and receive finance to reward them for these efforts. These jurisdictions greatly benefit, and in fact, my bio earlier I realized was outdated by 15 years. One of the things that I've done over the last couple of years being based in Asia was work with these jurisdictions, and I'm happy to see, having done this a couple of years ago, now the resources are flowing finally. So we have 270 million credits by 2028 that have already been generated. And in fact, these jurisdictions have been so successful that there's excess carbon credit from climate positive action in these landscapes to approach the private sector that is also quite hungry for these units to be purchased. So that's a major area of lessons and insights, and we want to take this forward as we continue to be financially innovative going forward.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Carolyn, and then we'll go to Q&A from the audience.
Sure, I'll be quick. So I think I'll just have to echo Nancy's thoughts on scale and connecting across those scales. So I see the climate problem at a very localized scale. I know that Alex and Nancy see it across those scales, both national, regional, sub-regional, and international and global. I think making those connections is essential. Linking those all together is really important. And the other thing that Nancy's story about Pakistan made me think about the recent floods in Dubai, where I think 2 years of rain dumped in like 24 hours, just wild photos, grounded all flights in Dubai, just really bananas. Thinking about scale in a different way. So time scales. So being able to balance dealing with a short-term crisis like in Dubai, like, okay, how are we going to manage with all this flooding? What are we going to do in the future? So short-term crisis versus long-term resilience. And that's something that our program is thinking about, how to strike a balance there. And I'm looking forward to the discussion about that. It's just on our minds.
Great, thank you. We are very short on time, but we can certainly take a couple of questions. Please very quickly state your name, your organization, and the question as opposed to a commentary. And please be mindful of getting as many people to the microphone as possible. So, gentlemen back there. Okay, and then it's okay. You go first and then pass it to the individual behind you a few rows.
Thank you so much for your comments so far. My name is Nico Hui. I work for Nexus International in the USAID Climate Finance for Development Accelerator. Thank you so much for your great points. I would love to hear a little bit more in this balance between mitigation finance and kind of the success that we have in the private sector. What more can we do to advance investment on the adaptation side by the private sector?
You take the one
I feel like that one's for you, bud.
No, we'll start, Alex, when you start there, and we'll line up the next question.
And of course, that is a big question, a challenging question. Within the World Bank, we're trying to find sort of the equivalent to a ton of carbon avoided or reduced in the resilience space. There's, of course, not that metric, but we're currently working on finding ways to define metrics that quantify resilience outcomes and see if we can link that somehow to results-based finance. Again, the same model would be applying that we've applied to emissions reductions, to the idea of boosting resilience and incentivizing that through results-based or outcome-focused metrics. So that's, of course, also connected very generally to how our institution, my institution, is transforming its focus on outcomes. So the whole corporate scorecard and how we measure our impact via outcomes would be connected to the kind of finance that we want to leverage going forward. So we don't have the solution yet, but certainly want to find ways of connecting this idea with the resilience space of the solution space as well, not just the mitigation part.
Great, thank you so much. And we have another question lined up right there.
Hi, Matthew Baer, the Climate Director of SID-US, and we've been talking mostly about emissions reduction practices right now, but some of the sectors that we're talking about, like rice and livestock, involve hundreds of millions of smallholders in the developing world. And I think we should be very cautious about proposing reduction technologies on people that struggle to meet their daily needs. So I was wondering if you could speak to this a little bit of strategies to encourage greater participation and perhaps blending resilience with emission reduction activities. Thank you.
Panelists?
Sure. Okay, that's a dissertation topic. So I am going to give a small sliver of that. And really, it's about gender and women and how they interconnect across all these themes. I think probably everybody or most people in the room probably read the FAO report that really talked about the role of women in agribusiness and how that'll increase economic output on the continent of Africa. But it's also about how we do things differently. It's in terms of lessons learned that Sue asked earlier, like what questions are we asking of women? You know, what seed do you want? Well, gosh, a man's going to choose a seed that grows quicker, but a woman might choose one that cooks quicker. And so how are we designing, responding to those voices in terms of adaptation, in terms of mitigation? But I think it requires all of us being a little bit more thoughtful in what we're doing to make sure that we're not disadvantaging those people in the very rural areas, those that are most at risk, the smallholder farmers, and of those that are most at risk, the women. And so I think it's really about, again, looking at these integrated systems. I'm a global water coordinator, super cool job. I mean, I really look at water and access to fresh water as a way of liberating women. You know, when women have access to tapped water, they have 80% more time, whether it's to help their kids with schoolwork or find off-farm work, economic, and that money comes back in. So it's just an example of like getting back to Caroline is very much about the local level voices. And I think it's about looking at those most marginalized, listening to their voices, and really being critical of our own work and how we need to do things differently.
Very quickly, Alex.
Complement with a 20-second addition to the answer. Smallholders, very much the focus of what we also want to do. We painted the big picture. One of the aspects of the solution that we haven't talked about is, of course, technology. And we see a lot of potential to use technology in smart ways to get to the smallholders, whether it's the introduction of agroforestry systems and measuring that from space and, you know, bringing the results to the market. That's one of the solution spaces. But, you know, very much the focus is, you know, how to engage the smallholders, facilitated by innovative technology and participating in these forms of innovative finance. And of course, I know many of you will probably work in this space as a solutions provider or technology expert consultant. But that's very much one of the exciting areas that we want to step in much more, you know, aggressively and forcefully going forward.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we are almost out of time. I would like to just take the very few minutes we have left and give each of you an opportunity to close with just very, very brief thought, comment, final message for the audience. So Carolyn, I'm going to mix things
mix
up.
it up,
See,
Sue.
got to stay on your toes.
Okay. Well, I've been very grateful to be here. It's really interesting to kind of learn from the folks on the panel and the rest of the audience as we mix and mingle. I think the scale of climate feels so, to me, feels so overwhelming. The scale of climate change, the things that we have to do it now. It feels very stress-inducing for all of us. But this is a spark of hope. And I think that the work that we're doing, both from the Stimson Center's perspective at the very local level, the work that the World Bank is doing in terms of providing these new and interesting solutions to climate finance, the work that USAID and its partners and allies around the world are doing to kind of change the game is really exciting and interesting. And it makes me happy to be working in this space and to actually have these sparks of hope, to be working on the ground to see it with my own eyes. We just announced it's the 16th Corby project in the island of Aruba. And so I'm really looking forward to kind of focusing on small island developing states and looking through and figuring out what solutions can we create for these very specific locations. And it's an exciting place to be in.
Thank you. Alex.
Final thoughts. I mentioned earlier that we're wrapping up this report, Recipe for a Livable Planet, that focuses, squarely on the question of this panel. And when you start writing a report, you can write a very long chapter 1 that describes the problem, and then you walk away very pessimistic and think that this is hopeless and let's go home. That's not what we did. The chapter 1 is very short. We know the problem. We focus on the solutions, and the solutions part of the report is much bigger, much longer. And you do find a lot of solutions when you start thinking about how to tackle the problem, again, in these different parts, starting with ecosystems, action on farm, but also all the way up the value chain to consumers. And there's lots of innovation. There is new consumer behavior that we didn't have 10 or 20 years ago. There's technology that we didn't have 10 or 20 years ago. There's an awareness that we didn't have 10 or 20 years ago. There's a framework agreement on climate change that we didn't have 10 years ago. And yes, it's moving more slowly than we all want to, but there's a framework and action that can be ratcheted up. Again, conducive environments. And there's innovations at all levels. Also the awareness that we cannot brute force this process. We have to be inclusive, bring the stakeholders along, bring the smallholders along, bring the food processor along in this process. Otherwise, you will have the result that we've seen from Europe, for instance, in the last couple of months, protests against climate positive agricultural policy. So there's also an insight. And when you drill deeper, you find actually this transformation brings a lot of opportunities, different kinds of jobs. When I announced to my grandparents who were smallholders that I was going to study agriculture, they said, that's the past. That's the past. That's not the future. I see completely differently. It's a different agriculture. We still need to have food to eat, but there's lots of innovation, research and development, and opportunities to be had also to make livelihoods going forward. So very much a positive outlook.
Nancy.
Thanks. I think if I can just say in general, probably everyone in this room thinks that climate change is accelerating. And if we can take that as a fact and look at Sue's question that she asked us, which I avoided with a positive story on why things have been so slow in terms of addressing this. I'd say number one is that we need to match the pace of what's happening in climate change. So we need to accelerate. And I think we need to look around 3 areas. And those are 3 themes that Caroline and Alex have really focused on. One is information. Who needs what and where and what's appropriate? If there's early warning systems in Africa and 60% of the continent doesn't have access to information that there's a storm coming, even 24 hours out, we can protect property and lives. We need to make sure that our research and our innovation is driven by demand, and that we're not only doing the research, but we're connecting it to actually application. And that would be one thing, if partners do in the room, is really think about what research we need that's been successful, what's cost effective, and what's data driven, and scale it. And then last, I think it's really about what Alex has talked about is investment, how, where, when, and what new kinds of investment. So looking really at innovation, information, and investment, and how we do those all at the same pace of the problem which we're trying to chase.
Thank you. I know we only had enough time to scratch the surface, but as you heard today, I think it's the combination of new thinking, enduring commitment, and identifying new solutions that will definitely give way to the spark of hope becoming reality. So please join me in thanking our panelists for being
Alex, thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, Nancy, thank you.